Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters. By Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 2. This chapter is necessarily retrospective of the preceding one. Among the earliest customers of Ephraim Foster, there came one morning a little white-headed boy, neither handsome nor ugly. Ephraim kept a shop in one of the thoroughfares that cross Grand Street, east of the Bowery. He sold milk, eggs, and sundry etceteras, in winter adding to his vocations those of a purveyor of pork and sausage meat, which is a driving and a thriving trade hereabout in cold weather. Fair America rivals ancient Greece in its love of pork. At the proper season you may see, thickly set through the streets, the places for furnishing this favorite winter eating. Beautiful red and white slices, mighty hams, either fresh or smoked, sides and forequarters, and at intervals a grinning head with fat cheeks and ears erect. Still more preferable to some is the powerfully spiced sausage meat or the jelly-like head cheese. In the preparation of the latter articles, the worthy Ephraim always did wonders, for folks had confidence in him, which is a great deal to bestow on a sausage vendor. However, he deserved it all. He deserved more. He was one of the best fellows that ever lived. People said now and then that he would never set the North River afire. And yet Foster jogged along, even in his pecuniary affairs, faster and steadier than some who had the reputation of much superior cunning. He was, without thinking of it at all, constitutionally kind, liberal, and unselfish. It was in a humble way, to be sure, but none the less credit for that. He had a knack of making mistakes against his own interest, giving the customer the odd pennies, and never gouging in weight or measure. Then, although the usual sign of "no trust" hung up over the counter, Ephraim did trust very much, particularly if the family asking indulgence were poor, or the father or mother was sick. Although this resulted several times in bad debts that were no trifle to a man in his sort of business, it was marvelous how, in the long run, he didn't really lose. One time, a year after a certain thumping bill had been utterly despaired of, and the poor journeyman cabinet-maker owing it had moved to another part of the city, things grew brighter with him, and he came round one cool evening to pay up like a man and make Ephraim's wife a pretty present of a work-box. Another time when the long score of a poor woman with little children had been allowed to accumulate nearly all winter, for otherwise they would have starved, the husband, an intemperate, shiftless character, died, and the woman was taken away by her friends. But strange to tell, who should be engaged by and by as cook in the house of a wealthy family 3 blocks off, but this very same woman, who grew fat and rosy in a good place, and not only paid the old score, long as it was, although Ephraim himself told her it was no matter and might as well go now, but the worthy cook began to grow angry then. Not only did she settle the bill, but sent her old friend a deal of profitable custom. The story of his good deeds went to the ears of the mistress, and thence into other people's, and you may depend Ephraim didn't lose anything by that. So with all his soft-heartedness, the man might be said to gain nearly enough to balance the really bad accounts, for they were not always coming back after he gave them up, those unfortunate bills. This was the sort of personage that the little flax-headed boy was lucky enough to come to. He didn't seem to have performed any morning toilet. He was bare-headed and bare-footed. Finally, he was about 10 years old. "And who are you, my man?" said Ephraim, for he had never seen the youngster before, although he knew, or thought so, every mother's child for a dozen blocks around. The towhead looked up in the shopkeeper's face and answered that his usual appellation was Jack. "And where do you come from?" continued Ephraim. Master Jack looked up again, but returned no reply at all. He drew in a long breath and let it out again, that sort of half-sigh that children sometimes make, still keeping his eyes at Ephraim's. "I want some breakfast," boldly came from his lips at last. Ephraim stopped a moment in his work of hauling out before the door his stands and milk cans, but the bit of astonishment was followed by something very much like gratified vanity. It wouldn't be every man, or woman either, that a little unfortunate might appeal to with the style of Jack's laconic speech. It was not a style where effrontery or the callous tone of an accustomed beggar struck out. It was rather like saying, "Sir, I see that you have a good heart, and that it always delights you to do a charitable deed." There was another thing. Ephraim had, 10 months before, been the possessor of a little white head, not much different from Jack's, only a good deal younger. But it was its fate one melancholy evening to be the subject of the consultation of 3 doctors of medicine, who attended it for 5 successive days. At the end of that time, the little white head was whiter than ever, for it was dead. So the good fellow's heart, thenceforward, warmed toward children with a still deeper warmth than before. Without any more ado, or any talk about it, the milkman and the child, by silent consent, seemed to form a mental compact. The new assistant took hold, and the two helped each other in all the preparations and putting to rights. Toe had sprinkled the flagstones in front, and swept them off. He would have done the same thing to the floor inside, only the owner himself had done it already. As he bustled and brushed about, Ephraim more than once stopped, under the influence of a meditative abstraction. He probably weighed in his mind the chances of the newcomer's honesty, for he looked closely at him from time to time. What particular notions flitted through the towhead, I now forget. And yet I ought to know something about it, for I was myself the forsaken young vagabond who found a friend in that pearl of a milkman. The Spirit of Christ impelled you, Ephraim, whether you knew it or not. If I had been turned off with a surly answer, there might have been a body lost, or perhaps a soul, for I was sorely distressed, parentless and homeless, just at the turning point where familiarity with crime is developed into something worse. Such was I when you took me in and ministered unto me. That was Chapter 2 of Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett.